Xenoblade Chronicles 3 is essentially the culmination of just about everything that was great about the previous entries in the Xenoblade series, but its DLC Future Redeemed manages to do things even better. First up, we have probably my favorite part of Future Redeemed, the newly added affinity scenes. I'm definitely a story kind of guy when it comes to Xenoblade, which is code for I suck at the game, so aside from some of the crazy new story bits here and there, much of this game was about the journey of reminiscing about stories of past Xenoblade games for me, which was done very well in the form of these affinity scenes. While this entire DLC expansion is one big love letter to the fans, these affinity scenes were, in my opinion, the pure embodiment of that. These scenes weren't necessarily to further the story or the gameplay at all, yet the developers put the time and effort in, as they always do at Monolith Soft, to craft these experiences just to satisfy the fans. I also like how they snuck in this little nod to the community. Let me know if there's some others like it that I missed. The sections in the game where you're slowed down to listen to dialogue are another welcome addition. From a gameplay perspective, yes, this can be annoying sometimes, but from a story perspective, it really helps to find a middle ground between cutscenes and interaction by allowing you to take in your surroundings. Next on this list is the characters. Heads up, in this next section, there are what you could consider character spoilers for Future Redeemed that I personally don't consider spoilers, as the part I'm talking about is obvious just from watching the final trailer for the game. With the addition of the ultimate Giga Chat alone, the lineup in Future Redeemed is already superior to the base Xenoblade 3 game, but then you gotta go and add the golden-haired Monado boy. Monado boy! And the... Nah, we're not getting into those kinds of spoilers. It doesn't matter anyway because we also get these two hunks children in the form of Glimmer and Nicole. Oh, and there's Matthew. Sure, there's much more time for richer character development in the base Xenoblade 3 game, but what do you call these? In all seriousness, Future Redeemed does have an unfair advantage since we're dealing with well-known characters. Don't get me wrong, there are definitely standout moments in terms of character development in Xenoblade 3, such as Uni and Land's sibling-like nature and Mio's arc, to name a couple of my favorites. I just feel like I connected more with the characters in Future Redeemed, and I'm not just talking about Rex and Shulk. Of course, there were all of Rex's moments, like when he calls Matthew Kiddo seemingly just to piss him off, and even heartfelt moments between Rex and Shulk and their kids, but I also really like that we got quite a bit of internal struggle with pretty much everyone. Well, except A. Nicole struggled with confidence, Glimmer struggled with a little bit of pride and selfishness, Matthew struggles with stubbornness and resentment, but mainly with his ideals versus Niall's feelings, Rex and Shulk struggled with parenting, and I think Rex also struggled with some other things that get into major spoiler territory, and as I stated earlier, A didn't really seem to struggle with anything. Well, other than trying to control Matthew, which brings me to the fact that I really just enjoyed the interaction between the characters in Future Redeemed. A treating Matthew like her kid because he won't behave, Glimmer having an attitude with just about everyone.
Nice going, smartass.
Nicole being the most awkward kid you've seen for the most part. I could also talk about Niall or how I felt Future Redeemed helped develop N's character, but for the sake of time I'm gonna stick with just the playable characters. Again, none of this is a knock on the main Xenoblade 3's characters, as everyone there has also had their own struggles as well as great interaction with each other. But taking into account the limited amount of time Future Redeemed had for character development, it knocked it out of the park for me. On to more of a gameplay difference, Future Redeemed introduces customizable completion bonus and heroic chain effects in the form of chain-specific accessories which include battle, tactic, and strategy manuals. Sure, these existed in Xenoblade 3, but being able to customize them gives the player so much more freedom in terms of strategizing and, let's be honest, in terms of making Giga Chad Rex as broken as possible. It makes chain attacks overall a more user-friendly experience, and it makes it to where you don't have to find specific characters in the form of heroes, like in the base game, to get a particular completion bonus or effect during chain attacks. And trust me, I'll get to heroes later. Back to more of the story side of things, Future Redeemed overall has much better pacing than Xenoblade 3 in terms of both story and gameplay. I'll admit this isn't really fair to the base game since Future Redeemed is naturally much shorter and kinda has to cut down on the fluff. Let me be clear in saying that I definitely wouldn't change anything about the stories in the main Xenoblade games because, again, a lot of the character and world building that isn't necessarily crucial helps enrich the story to make it better in my opinion. This sounds contradictory, but what I'm trying to say is that it's just nice to have a variety of pacing between all the DLC stories in the Xenoblade series and in all the main games. This also doesn't necessarily mean I prefer the stories of the DLC games better, I just sometimes prefer how they've been presented. In terms of gameplay pacing, it was nice not to have the long drawn out areas that Xenoblade games are notorious for. I understand part of the fun of Xenoblade is exploring, but but sometimes quicker progression is just nice. But this is coming from the guy who runs past a bunch of enemies I don't feel like fighting. Another thing Future Redeemed did better is that it added a much more straightforward way to upgrade your weapons that tied into the main story. The base Xenoblade 3 game had a weapon upgrading system that was locked behind a really long, tedious, and somewhat hidden side quest that, let's be honest, by the time you complete, you'll probably have beaten the game anyway. Future Redeemed not only flat out gives you the ability to upgrade weapons very early on, but upgrading them is arguably essential to progressing, at least in a timely manner. To contrast this, I completed the main story of the base Xenoblade 3 game without knowing weapon upgrades even existed. So unless you're just really good at Xenoblade games like I'm obviously not, weapon upgrades in Future Redeemed that again actually make sense and fit better into the story are going to be something you rely on pretty heavily throughout the game. Having the ability to just outright upgrade your weapons in Xenoblade Chronicles 2 was something that I missed, and I was kind of upset that it didn't return in its sequel, but I'm glad to see it at least returned in Future Redeemed. Future Redeemed also added the Enemypedia, which I really liked. Not once did I ever check this thing, well, maybe once. But you know what I did do? I skipped every enemy that had a green check mark above their head to signify that I didn't need to fight any more of that kind of enemy. Not only was it satisfying to complete an Enemypedia challenge, but I also felt like I was freed from the obligation of engaging another stupid bunnet. It was nice. Sticking with the mechanics side of things, the overall gameplay is not only more streamlined than the base game, but it's much simpler and more to the point. I wouldn't necessarily consider it a plus that Future Redeemed omits the ability to fully interlink, but I'll be honest, it's kinda nice not having them since its replacement is a lot quicker and not as clunky. As long as some of the fights in Xenoblade can be, it was nice to complete a Unity combo with one of these specials and just take a second to, you know, wipe the sweat off your controller for some bosses. I also liked that there were a very limited number of combinations to try out, making it more doable to find out who works best with who. I'm gonna say it again, but this just gives more customization to our chain attacks since we can control who performs a special chain order with who. Don't get me wrong, I enjoyed using the full power of the Ouroboros in the base Xenoblade 3 game for a time, but I didn't like how some of the fights felt dragged out to allow for you to rack up more damage from interlinking without it being OP. In addition to this, I also personally liked that we didn't have heroes or the class swapping system in Future Redeemed. The main reason I didn't like the heroes in Xenoblade 3 was for the fact that you couldn't actually play as them. Rather, you could only use their class on your main characters. And while, like the interlinking, these were both probably cut due to the size limits of this DLC that the developers had to work with, it kinda made the experience more enjoyable in my opinion. As far as the classes go, I didn't have to worry about spending all of this time constantly trying to figure out all of these new class combos with all of these different characters. And I didn't have to worry about making sure I changed them to some random class instead of continuing to use the ones that I really enjoyed playing with, all because that class got maxed out and it was recommended that I switch them. This obviously wasn't required and was more so a push in the direction to try all the classes, but it also made me feel like that if I didn't change the classes, I would be missing out on maximizing the potential of my team, even if this wasn't the case. It all just got a bit too overwhelming, to be honest. I liked that in Future Redeemed, I could just stick with one character, we all know who I'm talking about here, getting good with him and rolling along. If you're someone who likes to experiment with many different ways of playing, you may disagree with this and a lot of what I felt Future Redeemed did better. I personally like to find a specific playstyle that suits me best and master it. Or at least try. For those of you who watched my last video, I really can't thank you enough, as your support means more than you know. Let me know if I missed anything in this video that you thought was better in Future Redeemed, and thanks for watching till the end.